All right, we're going to start a new book, if you guys are ready for this. The period in this country, in America, in American history, when it really shifted towards the bad, when this country really was lost, even our measly privileges that the Constitution gave us, that the King of England graciously gave us in the Constitution. Put it this way, when our economic system of capitalism degenerated into monopoly capitalism, which can be seen in the 20th century, I believe, in the form of fascism. It happened in the late 1800s, the second half of the 1800s. And then you had, in the early 20th century, a group of writers called the muckrakers who were seeking to expose that. Upton Sinclair is maybe the most noteworthy. Unfortunately, he was a socialist or probably a communist or something. But he wrote the excellent novel The Jungle, and he wrote a bunch of other books that weren't that great. His novel Oil was pretty good, although it was turned into a really lousy movie with Daniel Day-Lewis recently. I like Daniel Day-Lewis, but not this movie. Upton Sinclair, he also ran for, was it governor of California? He was just a flaming socialist or communist. But he was a muckraker, and he did do some good work. He exposed the bias in the media, as Maureen Heaton in our last book pointed out. There was another muckraker, Ida Tarbell. She exposed the cretinous, deceitful, grasping, criminal dynasty, criminal enterprise that is the Rockefeller family. Ida Tarbell did that in the early 20th century. It's probably not a coincidence that you don't hear her name much anymore. I'm sure there were others, but there's another one that I heard the I-Man talk about on Viz's show, and these books are really mostly unknown today. The guy's name is Gustavus Myers, born in 1872, died in 1942. I'll give you a brief bio of him. Born in New Jersey in 1872, Gustavus Myers. His parents, Julia and Abram Myers, Dutch descent. What's really relevant? He was brought up in poverty and with little formal education, but he succeeded in gaining a foothold as a newspaper man in his early 20s, in the very late 1800s. And what he wrote about is, it wasn't just the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. There were a few other families who really gained control, monopoly control of disparate industries in America, and changed the face of the American economy forever. Capitalism was, they crushed it off, sometimes with legal means, sometimes with very illegal means, always shrewdly though. Names like Andrew Mellon, they captured the steel industry, but Vanderbilt, Gould, and there were some others. Well, this guy Gustavus Myers writes a few books, they're different volumes, about, they're called American Fortunes, about these dynastic families that, we call that period the period of the robber barons. These are the robber baron families. Gustavus Myers writes about them. I've not read this book. I'm looking forward to it. Most people do not know about Gustavus Myers anymore. He's like a mostly forgotten muckraking journalist. That leads me to suspect that there might be a lot to glean from his writings. When something is shoved down the memory hole, the further it's shoved down, the more truth it usually contains, has been my experience. So without further ado, let's find out what Gustavus Myers has to say in his American Fortunes. This is part 1. This is a foreword, a preface that Gustavus Myers writes in his 1909 edition. In writing this work, my aim has been to give the exact facts as far as the available material allows. Necessarily, it is impossible, from the very nature of the case, to obtain all the facts. Side note, folks, I have read about Gustavus Myers that the newspapers railed against what he was writing about, naturally, since the newspapers were bought off by these same robber baron families. But one thing the newspapers admitted, though, is that never once in Gustavus Myers' entire line of books and his whole writing career, never once were his facts shown to be erroneous. They couldn't challenge his facts. Okay. Gustavus Myers writes, "It is obvious that in both past and present times, the chief beneficiaries of our social and industrial system have found it to their interest to represent their accumulations as the rewards of industry and ability, and have likewise had the strongest motives for concealing the circumstances of all those complex and devious methods which have been used in building up great fortunes. In this they have been assisted by a society so constituted that the means by which these great fortunes have been amassed have been generally lauded as legitimate and exemplary. The possessors of towering fortunes have hitherto been described in 2 ways. On the one hand, they have been held up as marvels of success, as preeminent examples of thrift, enterprise, and extraordinary ability. More recently, however, the tendency in certain quarters has been diametrically the opposite. This latter class of writers, intent upon pandering to a supposed popular appetite for sensation, pile exposure upon exposure and hold up the objects of their diatribes as monsters of commercial and political crime. Neither of these classes has sought to establish definitely the relation of the great fortunes to the social and industrial system which has propagated them. Consequently, these superficial effusions and tirades, based upon a lack of understanding of the propelling forces of society, have little value other than as reflections of a certain aimless and disordered spirit of the times. With all their volumes of print, they leave us in possession of a scattered array of assertions bearing some resemblance to facts, which, however, fail to be facts, inasmuch as they are either distorted to take shape as fulsome eulogies or as wild, meaningless onslaughts. They give no explanation of the fundamental laws and movements of the present system, which have resulted in these vast fortunes. Nor is there the least glimmering of a scientific interpretation of a succession of states and tendencies from which these men of great wealth have emerged. With an entire absence of comprehension, they portray our multimillionaires as a phenomenal group whose sudden rise to their sinister and overshadowing position is a matter of wonder and surprise. They do not seem to realize for a moment what is clear to every real student of economics, that the great fortunes are the natural, logical outcome of a system based upon factors, the inevitable result of which is the utter despoilment of the many for the benefit of a few. You hear that, folks? You want to know why your wife's out there working too? Gustavus Myers just told you. This being so, our plutocrats rank as nothing more or less than as so many unavoidable creations of a set of processes which must imperatively produce a certain set of results. These results we see in the accelerated concentration of immense wealth running side by side with a propertyless, expropriated, and exploited multitude. Boy, does that sound like the American public today. The dominant point of these denunciatory emanations, however, is that certain of our men of great fortune have acquired their possessions by dishonest methods. These men are singled out as especial creatures of infamy. Their doings and sayings furnish material for many pages of assault. Here again, an utter lack of knowledge and perspective is observable. For, while it is true that the methods employed by these very rich men have been, and are, fraudulent, it is also true that they are but the more conspicuous types of a whole class which, in varying degrees, has used precisely the same methods, and the collective fortunes and power of which have been derived from identically the same sources. In diagnosing an epidemic, it is not enough that we should be content with the symptoms. Wisdom and the protection of the community demand that we should seek and eradicate the cause. Both wealth and poverty spring from the same essential cause. Neither, then, should be indiscriminately condemned as such. The all-important consideration is to determine why they exist and how such an absurd contrast can be abolished. In taking up a series of types of great fortunes, as I have done in this work, my object has not been the current one of portraying them either as remarkable successes or as unspeakable criminals. My purpose is to present a number of sufficient examples as indicative of the whole character of the vested class and of the methods which have been employed, and in doing this neither prejudice nor declamation has entered. Such a presentation, I believe, cannot fail to be useful for many reasons. It will, in the first place, satisfy a spirit of inquiry. As time passes and the power of the propertied oligarchy becomes greater and greater, he's calling it, more and more of a studied attempt is made to represent the origin of that property as the product of honest toil and great public service. Every searcher for truth is entitled to know whether this is true or not. But what is much more important is for the people to know what have been the cumulative effects of a system which subsists upon the institutions of private property and wage labor. If it possesses the many virtues that it is said to possess, what are these virtues? If it is a superior order of civilization, in what does this superiority consist? This work will assist in explaining, for naturally a virtuous and superior order ought to produce virtuous and superior men. The kind and quality of methods and successful ruling men which this particular civilization forces to the front are set forth in this exposition. Still more important is the ascertainment of where these stupendous fortunes came from, their particular origin and growth, and what significance the concomitant methods and institutions have to the great body of the people. I may add that in Part 1, no attempt has been made to present an exhaustive account of conditions in settlement and colonial times. I have merely given what I believe to be a sufficient resume of conditions leading up to the later economic developments in the United States. Signed, Gustavus Myers, September 1st, 1909. Chapter 1 of American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. The Great Proprietary Estates. The noted private fortunes of settlement and colonial times were derived from the ownership of land and the gains of trading. Usually both had a combined influence and were frequently attended by agriculture. Throughout the colonies were scattered lords of the soil, who held vast territorial domains, over which they exercised an arbitrary and, in some portions of the colonies, a feudal sway. Nearly all the colonies were settled by chartered companies, organized for purely commercial purposes, and the success of which largely depended upon the emigration which they were able to promote. These corporations were vested with enormous powers and privileges, which in effect constituted them as sovereign rulers, although their charters were subject to revision or amendment. The London Company, thrice chartered to take over to itself the land and resources of Virginia and populate its zone of rule, was endowed with sweeping rights and privileges which made it an absolute monopoly. The impecunious noblemen or gentlemen who transported themselves to Virginia to recoup their dissipated fortunes or seek adventure encountered no trouble in getting large grants of land, especially when, after 1614, tobacco became a fashionable article in England and took rank as a valuable commercial commodity. Over this colony now spread planters who hastened to avail themselves of this newfound means of getting rich. Land and climate alike favored them, but they were confronted with a scarcity of labor. The emergency was promptly met by the buying of white servants in England to be resold in Virginia to the highest bidder. This, however, was not sufficient, and complaints poured over to the English government. As the demands of commerce had to be sustained at any price, a system was at once put into operation for gathering in as many of the poorer English class as could be impressed upon some pretext, and shipping them over to be held as bonded laborers. Side note, that's called man-stealing, and Scripture, the Word of God, outlaws that in the book of Joshua. Scripture does not outlaw bond servitude, slavery, but it does outlaw man-stealing. Penniless and lowly Englishmen, arrested and convicted for any one of the multitude of offenses then provided for severely in law, were transported as criminals or sold into the colonies as slaves for a term of years. The English courts were busy grinding out human material for the Virginia plantations, and, as the objects of commerce were considered paramount, this process of disposing of what was regarded as the scum element was adjudged necessary and justifiable. No voice was raised in protest. The introduction of black slaves. But, fast as the English courts might work, they did not supply laborers enough. It was with exultation that in 1619 the plantation owners were made acquainted with a new means of supplying themselves with adequate workers. A Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown with a cargo of Negroes from Guinea. The blacks were promptly bought at good prices by the planters. From this time forth, the problem of labor was considered sufficiently solved, as chattel slavery harmonized well with the necessities of tobacco growing and gain, it was accepted as a just condition and was continued by the planters, whose interests and standards were the dominant factor. After 1620, when the London Company was dissolved by royal decree and the commerce of Virginia made free, the planters were the only factor. Virginia, it was true, was made a royal province and put under deputy rule, but the big planters contrived to get the laws and customs their self-interest called for. There were only two classes: the rich planters, with their gifts of land, their bond servants and slaves, and, on the other hand, the poor whites. A middle class was entirely lacking. As the supreme staple of commerce, and as currency itself, tobacco could buy anything, human as well as inert material. The labor question had been sufficiently vanquished, but not so the domestic. Wives were much needed. The officials in London instantly hearkened, and in 1620 sent over 60 young women, who were auctioned off and bought at from 120 to 160 pounds of tobacco each. Tobacco then sold at 3 shillings a pound. Its cultivation was assiduously carried on. The use of the land, mainly for agricultural purposes, led to the foundation of numerous settlements along the shores, bays, rivers, and creek with which Virginia is interspersed, and which afforded accessibility to the seaports. As the years wore on, and the means and the laborers of the planters increased, their lands became more extensive, so that it was not an unusual thing to find plantations of 50 or 60,000 acres. But neither in Virginia nor in Maryland, under the almost regal powers of Lord Baltimore, who had proprietary rights over the whole of his province, were such huge estates to be seen as were being donated in the northern colonies, especially in the New Netherlands and in New England. Feudal grants in the north. In its intense aim to settle New Netherlands and make use of its resources, Holland, through the States General, offered extraordinary inducements to promoters of colonization. The prospect of immense estates with feudal rights and privileges was held out as the alluring incentive. The Bill of Freedoms and Exemptions of 1629 made easy the possibility of becoming a lord of the soil, with comprehensive possessions and powers. Any man who should succeed in planting a colony of 50 quote-unquote souls, each of whom was to be more than 15 years old, was to become at once a patroon, with all the rights of lordship. He was permitted to own 16 miles along shore, or on one side of a navigable river. An alternative was given of the ownership of 8 miles on one side of a river, and as far into the interior, quote, as the situation of the occupiers will permit, unquote. You mean the Indians? The title was vested in the patroon forever, and he was presented with a monopoly of the resources of his domain, except for furs and pelts. No patroon, I keep wanting to think poltroon. No patroon, we're talking about Netherlands. I guess that's Dutch for patron. I have no clue. No patroon or other colonist was allowed to make woolen, linen, cotton, or cloth of any material under pain of banishment. These restrictions were in the interest of the Dutch West India Company, a commercial corporation which had well-nigh dictatorial powers. A complete monopoly, sounds like Monsanto or something today, or Standard Oil. A complete monopoly throughout the whole of its subject territory. It was armed with sweeping powers, a formidable equipment, and had a great prestige. We could be very well talking about some of our giant corporations today. It was somewhat of a cross between legalized piracy and a body of adroit colonization promoters. Again, you could say that of some of our mega corporations today, the ones who are dealing overseas. Pillage and butchery were often its auxiliaries, although in these respects it in no wise equaled its twin corporation, the Dutch East India Company, whose exploitation of Holland's Asiatic possessions was a long record of horrors. The Dutch West India Company. The policy of the Dutch West India Company was to offer generous prizes for peopling the land while simultaneously forbidding competition with any of the numerous products or commodities dealt in by itself. This had much to do with determining the basic character of the conspicuous fortunes of a century and 2 centuries later. It followed that when native industries were forbidden, or their output monopolized, not only by the Dutch West India Company in New Netherlands, but by other companies elsewhere in the colonies, that ownership of land became the mainstay of large private fortunes, with agriculture as an accompanying factor. Subsequently, the effects of this continuous policy were more fully seen when England, by law after law, paralyzed or closed up many forms of colonial manufacture. The feudal character of Dutch colonization, as carried on by the Dutch West India Company, necessarily created great landed estates, the value of which arose not so much from agriculture, as was the case in Virginia, Maryland, and the later Carolinas and Georgia, but from the natural resources of the land. The superb primitive timber brought colossal profits in export, and there were also very valuable fishery rights where an estate bounded a shore or river. The pristine rivers were filled with great shoals of fish, to which the river fishing of the present day cannot be compared. As settlement increased, immigration pressed over, and more ships carried cargo to and fro, these estates became consequently more valuable. To encourage colonization to its colonies still further, the States General in 1635 passed a new decree. It repeated the feudal nature of the rights granted and made strong additions. Did any aspiring adventurer seek to leap at a bound to the exalted position of patroonship, the terms were easy. All that he had to do was to found a colony of 48 adults, and he had a liberal 6 years in which to do it. For his efforts he was allowed even more extensive grants of land than under the Act of 1629. So complete were his powers of proprietorship that no one could approach within 7 or 8 miles of his jurisdiction without his express permission. He was really a principality. Over its bays, rivers, and islands, had it any, as well as over the mainland, he was given command forever. The dispensation of justice was his exclusive right. He, and he only, was the court, with summary powers of, quote, high, low, and middle jurisdiction, unquote, which were harshly or capriciously exercised. Not only did he impose sentence for violation of laws, but he himself ordained those laws, and they were laws which were always framed to coincide with his interests and personality. He had full authority to appoint officers and magistrates and enact laws. And finally, he had the power of policing his domain and of making use of the titles and arms of his colonies. All these things he could do, quote, according to his will and pleasure, unquote. These absolute rights were to descend to his heirs and assigns. Old world traders become feudal lords. Thus, at the beginning of settlement times, the basis was laid in law and custom of a landed aristocracy, or rather a group of entrenched autocrats along the banks of the Hudson, the shores of the ocean, and far inland. The theory then prevailed that the territory of the colonies extended westward to the Pacific. From these patroons and their lineal or collateral descendants issued many of the landed generations of families which, by reason of their wealth and power, proved themselves powerful factors in the economic and political history of the country. The sinister effects of this first great grasping of the land long permeated the whole fabric of society and were prominently seen before and after the Revolution, and especially in the third and fourth decades of the 18th century. The results, in fact, are traceable to this very day, even though laws and institutions are so greatly changed. Other colonies reflected the constant changes of government, ruling party, or policy of England, and colonial companies chartered by England frequently forfeited their charters. But conditions in New Netherlands remained stable under Dutch rule, and the accumulation of great estates was intensified under English rule. It was in New York that, at that period, the foremost colonial estates and the predominant private fortunes were mostly held. The extent of some of those early estates was amazingly large, but they were far from being acquired wholly by colonization methods. Many of the officers and directors of the Dutch West India Company were Amsterdam merchants. Active, scheming, self-important men, they were mighty in the money marts, but were made use of and looked down upon by the old Dutch aristocracy. Having amassed fortunes, these merchants yearned to be founders of great estates, to live as virtual princes in the midst of wide possessions, even if these were still comparative solitudes. This aspiration was mixed with the mercenary motive of themselves owning the land from whence came the furs, and the pelts, the timber, and the waters yielding the fishes. One of these directors was Kilian van Rensselaer, an Amsterdam pearl merchant. In 1630, his agents bought for him from the Indians a tract of land 24 miles long and 48 broad on the west bank of the Hudson. It comprised, it was estimated, 700,000 acres and included what are now the counties of Albany, Rensselaer, a part of Columbia County, and a strip of what is at present Massachusetts. And what was the price paid for this vast estate? As the deeds showed, the munificent consideration of, quote, certain quantities of duffels, axes, knives, and wampum, unquote, which is equal to saying that the pearl merchant got it for almost nothing. Two other directors, Godin and Blomart, became owners of great feudal estates. One of these tracts in what is now New Jersey, extended 16 miles both in length and breadth, forming a square of 64 miles. So it was that these shrewd directors now combined a double advantage. Their pride was satisfied with the absolute lordship of immense areas, while the ownership of land gave them the manifold benefits and greater profits of trading with the Indians at first hand. From a part of the proceeds they later built manors which were contemplated as wonderful and magnificent. Surrounded and served by their retainers, agents, vassal tenants, and slaves, they lived in princely and licentious style, knowing no law in most matters except their unrestrained will. They beheld themselves as ingenious and memorable founders of a potential landed aristocracy whose possessions were more extended than that of Europe. Wilderness, much of it still was, but obviously the time was coming when the population would be fairly abundant. The laws of entail and primogeniture, then in full force, would operate to keep the estates intact and gifted with inherent influence for generations. Along with their landed estates, these directors had a copious inflowing revenue. The Dutch West India Company was in a thriving condition. By the year 1629, it had more than 100 full-rigged ships in commission. Most of them were fitted out for war, on the commerce of other countries, or on pirates. 15,000 seamen and soldiers were on its payroll. In that 1 year, it used more than 100,000 pounds of powder, significant of the grim quality of business done. It had more than 400 cannon and thousands of other destructive weapons. Anything conducive to profit, no matter if indiscriminate murder, was accepted as legitimate and justifiable functions of trade, and was imposed alike upon royalty, which shared in the proceeds, and upon the people at large. The energetic trading class concentrated in one effort of getting money, and having no scruples as to the means. In an age when ideals were low and vulgar, had already begun to make public opinion in many countries, although this public opinion counted for little among the submissive peoples. It was the king and the governing class, either or both, whose favor and declarations counted. And so long as these profited by the devious extortions and villainies of trade, the methods were legitimized, if not royally sanctioned. An aristocracy solidly grounded. A more potentially robust aristocracy than that which was forming in New Netherlands could hardly be imagined. Resting upon gigantic gifts of land, with feudal accompaniments, it held a monopoly, or nearly one, of the land's resources. The old aristocracy of Holland grew jealous of the power and pretensions of what it frowned upon as an upstart trading clique, and tried to curtail the rights and privileges of the patroons. These latter contended that their absolute lordship was indisputable. To put it in modern legal terminology, that a contract could not be impaired. They elaborated upon the argument that they had spent a quote-unquote ton of gold, parentheses, amounting to 100,000 guilders, or $40,000, end parentheses. This is in 1900 money. Upon their colonies, they not only carried their point, but their power was confirmed and enlarged. Now was seen the spectacle of the middle-class men of the old world. The traders, more than imitating, far exceeding, the customs and pretensions of the aristocracy of their own country which they had inveighed against, and setting themselves up as the original and mighty landed aristocracy of the new country. The patroons encased themselves in an environment of pomp and awe. Like so many petty monarchs, each had his distinct flag and insignia. Each fortified his domain with fortresses, armed with cannon, and manned by his paid soldiery. The colonists were but humble dependents. They were his immediate subjects and were forced to take the oath of fealty and allegiance to him. In the old country, the soil had long since passed into the hands of a powerful few, and was made the chief basis for the economic and political enslavement of the people. To escape from this thraldom, many of the immigrants had endured hardships and privation to get here. They expected that they could easily get land, the tillage of which would ensure them a measure of independence. Upon arriving, they found vast available parts of the country, especially the most desirable and accessible portions bordering shores or rivers, preempted. An exacting and tyrannous feudal government was in full control. That didn't take long. Their only recourse in many instances was to accept the best of unwelcome conditions and become tenants of the great landed functionaries and workers for them. How fascinating, how quickly a landed aristocracy was set up in the New World. Didn't take long at all. Oh boy. The abasement of the workers. The patroons naturally encouraged immigration. Apart from the additional values created by increased population, it meant a quantity of labor which, in turn, would precipitate wages to the lowest possible scale. That's right. That's straight out of the Grapes of Wrath. You get lure as many poor people out to your job site as you can, and then you can pay them less. You start a competition war, have them each undercutting each other's wages, and you pay the guy who will work the cheapest. And they're poor, so they're trapped once you get out there. That's the strategy that was used, documented really, in the Grapes of Wrath upon the poor Okie migrant workers. The landed California aristocracy pulled that one off on them. At the same time, in order to stifle every aspiring quality in the drudging laborer, and to keep in conformity with the spirit and custom of the age, which considered the worker a mere menial, undeserving of any rights, the whole force of the law was made use of to bring about sharp discriminations. The laborer was purposely abased to the utmost, and he was made to feel in many ways his particular low place in the social organization. Far above him, vested with enormous personal and legal powers, towered the patroon, while he, the laborer, did not have the ordinary burgher right, that of having a minor voice in public affairs. The burgher right was made entirely dependent upon property, which was a facile method of disenfranchising the multitude of poor immigrants and of keeping them down. Same old, same old. Mankind never changes. Purchase was the one and only means of getting this right. To keep it in as small and circumscribed class as possible, the price was made abnormally high. It was enacted in New Netherlands in 1659, for instance, that immigrants coming with cargoes had to pay 1,000 guilders for the burgher right. as the average laborer got 2 shillings a day for his long hours of toil, often extending from sunrise to sunset, he had little chance of ever getting this sum together. The consequence was that the merchants became the burgher class, and all the records of the time seem to prove conclusively that the merchants were servile instruments of the patroons, whose patronage and favor they assiduously courted. This deliberately pursued policy of degrading and despoiling the laboring class incited bitter hatreds and resentments, the effects of which were permanent. Okay, that was Chapter 1 of Gustavus Myers, The History of the Great American Fortunes. Man, I'm looking forward to getting into the Rockefeller part and all of that sordid affair. All right, you've been listening to the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Thanks for listening. Different volumes about, they're called American Fortunes, about these dynastic families that, well, we call that period the period of the robber barons. These are the robber baron families. Gustavus Myers writes about them. I've not read this book. I'm looking forward to it. Most people do not know about Gustavus Myers anymore. He's like a mostly forgotten muckraking journalist. That leads me to suspect that there might be a lot to glean from his writings. When something is shoved down the memory hole, the further it's shoved down, the more truth it usually contains, has been my experience. So without further ado, let's find out what Gustavus Myers has to say in his American Fortunes. This is Part 1. This is a foreword, or preface, that Gustavus Myers writes in his 1909 edition. In writing this work, my aim has been to give the full, grasping, criminal dynasty, criminal enterprise that is the Rockefeller family. Ida Tarbell did that in the early 20th century. It's probably not a coincidence that you don't hear her name much anymore. I'm sure there were others, but there's another one that I heard the I-Man talk about on Viz's show, and these books are really mostly unknown today. The guy's name is Gustavus Myers, born in 1872, died in 1942. I'll give you a brief bio of him. Born in New Jersey in 1872, Gustavus Myers. His parents, Julia and Abram Myers, Dutch descent. What's really relevant? He was brought up in poverty and with little formal education, but he succeeded. All right, we're going to start a new book, if you guys are ready for this. The period in this country, in America, in American history, when it really shifted towards the bad, when this country really was lost, even our measly privileges that the Constitution gave us, that the King of England graciously gave us in the Constitution. Put it this way, when our economic system of capitalism degenerated into monopoly capitalism, which can be seen in the 20th century, I believe, in the form of fascism. It happened in the late 1800s, the second half of the 1800s. And then you had, in the early 20th century, a group of writers called the muckrakers, who were seeking to expose that. Upton Sinclair is maybe the most noteworthy. Unfortunately, he was a socialist or probably a communist or something. But he wrote the excellent novel The Jungle, and he wrote a bunch of other books that weren't that great. His novel Oil was pretty good, although it was turned into a really lousy movie with Daniel Day-Lewis. recently. I like Daniel Day-Lewis, but not this movie. Upton Sinclair, he also ran for, was it governor of California? He was just a flaming socialist or communist. But he was a muckraker, and he did do some good work. He exposed the bias in the media, as Maureen Heaton in our last book pointed out. There was another muckraker, Ida Tarbell. She exposed the cretinous, deceit in gaining a foothold as a newspaper man in his early 20s, in the very late 1800s. And what he wrote about is, it wasn't just the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. There were a few other families who really gained control, monopoly control of disparate industries in America, and changed the face of the American economy forever. Capitalism was, they crushed it off, sometimes with legal means, sometimes with very illegal means, always shrewdly, though. Names like Andrew Mellon, they captured the steel industry, but Vanderbilt, Gould, and there were some others. Well, this guy Gustavus Myers writes a few books.